just a second. Okay, so Jason said this is a new one on him, so he's interested to see what this looks like. Well, it's a new one on me too. But last few weeks, I've spent some time going over this to get a little bit familiar with what the clearinghouse is and how we need to be using it when it comes to managing our commercial drivers, their CDL licenses, those that are governed by the DOT and FMCSA regulations. The clearinghouse is something that is now available for us to be able to both report into as well as draw reports. Its purpose is to help you as an employer be able to make sure that you've done the required checks to verify that your commercial drivers are authorized, or that you can authorize them under the regulations to operate those motor vehicles, those commercial motor vehicles for you. So today we want to learn just a little bit about what's new with this clearinghouse, what's it going to mean to us, how it works, and what is it that we need to do different going forward. A lot of what we're looking at in this, we're not really doing anything super different as far as the actual, drug and alcohol testing requirements. What is a prohibited conduct when it comes to the DOT regulations on drug and alcohol. Those rules don't really change a whole lot. So if you're really familiar, with when a driver can and can't drive and what's a fake, for the test and any prohibited conduct, then know that that's not really changing. This is just a change in how we track violations that have occurred in the past, and be able to check on new drivers and to see what kind of history they have as far as violations with regards to the drug and alcohol program with the federal motor carriers in the Department of Transportation. So it's kind of interesting when you look at this. The clearinghouse involves quite a few different roles, people who will be getting information from the clearinghouse or from this database, as well as those who are required to report information into the database. Obviously, employers are affected. Employers have to be in the database. You have to set up an account to be able to get in there to not only draw information or queries, they call them, on individual drivers, but also you need to be reporting violations that occur into the database. Sometimes you may be using a service agent. If you have a CTPA, a third-party agent who helps you with your drug and alcohol testing program, for example, if you're using a consortium, for example, they also need to be reporting into this system as well. There are the substance abuse professionals. If you have a policy that allows for an employee who fails a test, for example, to be able to go through a treatment or a rehabilitation program, then that would have to be reported into the database as well. And those substance abuse professionals, or SAPs that they call them, then have to report into the system when that driver has successfully completed their return to duty program. There's also medical review officers. When you send your employee to have a drug test, the medical review officer has to be signed up in the system so that they can also report the results of the drug test. And basically, we don't need to report when the drug test is negative, but we do need to report if there's a fail. So if there's a positive drug test or an alcohol screening that is above the limit of 0.04. Also, there are some potential impacts on any data storage service providers that you use if you have information from your drug and alcohol program and testing program being stored with a data storage, like a cloud data storage company, because there is privacy rules that are in play with these new regulations. And so it may affect some of those companies as well. And then also the employee, obviously the drivers have to be in this program. In fact, we're not only required that the employers be logged in and have an account in the clearinghouse, but drivers also have to, log in. They have to create an account for them in the system so that the employer can then query their records. And so it's something that you're going to have to do as an administrator, but all of your drivers are going to have to get into this system and get signed up as well. So when we look at the registration requirements, there's obviously you as the employer, your drivers that need to be registered, the clinics that you use to do your drug testing, their medical review officers have to be logged in and have to have an account in this system. If you are using substance abuse professionals for return to duty programs, they need to be in the system as well. And if you have any third-party agents, they need to be in that system. And we'll talk a little bit more about, how it works and who's responsible for that reporting. So the Drug and Alcohol Clearinghouse database, when you first say that, I kind of sounds like it's, a clearinghouse, like it's a warehouse that you can go to or something, but we are just talking about a database here. It's for CDL drivers for the drug and alcohol program violations. We don't need to, like I said, report any clean tests into the system. We just need to report violations of the program, whether that's a failed test or whether that is a mandatory return to duty rehabilitation process that has been begun and whether that has been completed as well. The clearinghouse database has two primary functions. One is to do queries, is to be able to get a report on a driver. And then the other function is for us to report into the database, any violations that have occurred that we are required to report. When we look at the query, there's a couple different kinds of queries that we would be looking at. Employers will be required or are required to run queries on all covered drivers, for two basic purposes. Number one, for pre-employment screening. When we're doing a pre-employment screening, we have to determine the eligibility of that driver to operate a commercial vehicle for us. And this requires a full query. And so there's two different types of queries. There's a full query, there's a limited query. And so when we're doing this pre-employment screening, we should be doing a full query at that point. When you do a full query on the driver has to give their specific consent. You can't just log into the system and run a check on whoever you want to. The driver has to go in with their login information and they have to specifically authorize you. They'll select you as their employer and give you consent or their consent to be able to check those records. And so that's what we refer to as electronic consent. And then there's also a requirement that you do an annual verification. And this often is just going to be a limited query and where you go in to check and see if there's been any changes in the data for your drivers. Let's say you have drivers and they have a secondary employment where they're also operating as a commercial driver, they're operating commercial vehicles. And so maybe they have another employer that they've worked for who has reported into the system violations that you're not aware of. So we need to make sure that every year we go in and do a limited query. When you do a limited query, all we're really getting back out of that query is whether there is information in the database or not. You don't get any specific details. And often that's all you'll need to do. And so you just look, there's no information in the system, and that'll satisfy that requirement. This program went live. The requirement for us to be participating in this database, both as drivers as well as employers, was January 6th of last month. So January 6th, 2020. This is a program that's kind of been in the works for most of a decade. I think since about 2012, we, grumblings about this database, is coming. And since 2016, the actual regulations have been live, but the system itself, hasn't been ready to go until now. So this last month is the month where that system is now live and we're now required to be logging in and using this system. So let's, take another look. I mentioned a little bit about these queries already. The limited queries only tell you if there's information about the driver in the database. If you have a return on the limited query, you do a query and it says, yes, there is information on this driver in the database, then that triggers a full query. If you're not, on those limited queries, generally that's all you're going to have to do. If it does have a return, then you need to run the full query, which again requires the driver's electronic consent. And so they have to go into that system before you can run that full query to see what that information is that's regarding them in the system right there. Full queries require that consent. And if you don't have the consent, you can't run the query. And if you can't run the query, then your driver cannot to operate a commercial vehicle for you. So at that point, if you see there's information there and your driver has not gone into the system to grant you access to the information, then he or she cannot operate a vehicle, which will have whatever consequences that has on their job at that time. So it really is, they have to give their consent, but they don't really have an option not to give their consent, because if they don't give their consent, they cannot drive that commercial vehicle according to these DOT regulations. That information, once it's in the database, stays in there for most instances for 5 years before it clears out of that system. If you have a mandatory return to duty deficiency, someone's failed the test, you've sent them to see a professional to go through a return to duty program, and they don't complete that program, then that information stays in the system indefinitely. Let's say that they, failed the test and they were referred out to a return to duty program, and then they quit and they left and they never finished the program. Well, any other employer who wants to then look at hiring this employee, when they go into the system and run a full query on them, they will see that they have an incomplete return to duty program, and they would then have to contact you or whoever the previous employer was to find out what that program requirement was and what that driver needs to do to complete that program. So that's kind of an exception to that 5-year data rule. When you have an open return to duty program in there that's not completed, that will just stay in there forever until it gets closed out.
Hey, Doug, I've got a question while you take a breath. Jess asks, once you get full query consent, will that have to be given every year? Or if you are given the permission once, does that last forever, or each time you do that?
So I may have a slide in here that kind of touches on it here in a second, but we'll go ahead and address that. So that driver has to give you that full query consent, I believe, every time. And so if it's a pre-employment, then they have to go in and give you that consent. If a year later, when you're doing a limited query and it comes up with information in there that you're not aware of and you need to do the full query, then that driver will then again need to give you that electronic consent. Now, for being able to do the limited query, you're also required to have consent from the driver, but it doesn't have to be the electronic consent that's in the clearinghouse system. You can have them sign a form that gives you consent to run the limited query on them. That consent can be either for a single year, or you can write it up so that it's for multiple years. You could write it up so it's good for 2 or 3 years. I'm not quite sure if there's a limit on that. I think the example I saw suggested, it could be like 2 or 3 years. So for the limited queries, you can have them sign a paper document that gives you consent for multiple years. But that full query, I believe, requires the driver to go into the system and grant you access probably every time. It may be good for a year, but I think it may need to be activated every time. Now, I have to admit that I'm not the expert here. I haven't been able to log into the system because I don't employ any drivers. And so, if I go in and try and log in the system and set up an account, I'm not, a qualified employer. I do, been able to go through and see screenshots of the login process and how you set up your accounts. So as far as how that actually works, I'm going to feign a little bit of ignorance here. Like I said, I'm pretty new to this as well, but that is my understanding, is that for the full query, that driver would need to grant you that consent in the system prior to you being able to run a full query. So here it is, the slide. We're talking about the consent. So you have to obtain consent from the driver before accessing their information in the clearinghouse. That consent can be written or electronic. And again, for the full queries, it has to be electronic. They have to go into the system. And the driver has to submit that themselves. The written consent can be annual or multi-year, but that just covers the limited queries. You need to have that written consent, and you need to keep a record of it because that is subject to audit. The Department of Transportation potentially could come in and want to verify that you have your required documentation, including these written consents. So when you get those, make sure you are keeping those. So requirements for reporting into the clearinghouse. When do we need to actually go in and report, a violation? Number one, your medical review officer has a duty when someone comes in for a test, a required test under regulation, DOT regulation. Now, and I would point out, if you're sending the driver in for a required drug or alcohol test under DOT regulations, that's when this applies. If you're sending a driver in for a test under your own policy, it's not something that was actually triggers a DOT requirement because of your own district, city, county policy, there's a drug test required. Now that would not require that you report any failures there into the clearinghouse. It's only if the tests are being done as a result of and in accordance with the DOT regulations. So once the MRO is conducted a test, if there is a failed test, which would be a positive drug test or an adulterated sample or a substituted sample, or if the employee arrives at the testing center and refuses to then produce a sample, refuses to test, then the MRO is required to report into the clearinghouse that violation, and that has to be done within 2 days of that day that the driver came in for that test. If there is a change, if the MRO enters information into the system and then they later on realize that there was a mistake or something was entered in wrong, or the test results were re-verified and it turned out it wasn't a fail after all, then they have 1 day to get back into the system and then make changes to those results that they had already entered. Now, for the employer, you have a reporting duty, obviously, as well. Your reporting duty gives you 3 days, 3 business days, from the time that the violation occurred or that you identified the violation. And again, these violations are not new. These are things that you're probably already familiar with. For example, if you've got a driver who tests at 0.02, we know we can't let him drive until he's under 0.02. But if a driver is greater than 0.04 or greater, then that's a fail, and that has to be reported into the system. A negative return to duty test. So someone has failed the test, we booted them out, they've gone through their process of return to duty, they come back, we test them again, and they get a negative drug test, or excuse me, I got that backwards. When they come back on a return to duty and they have a negative test, so they're clean, then we have to report into the system that they had a successful return to duty test so that it can close the books on that open, return to duty program. If you have a refusal to test, also, if you tell your driver, hey, you got to go down and take a drug test, and they say, I'm not doing it, then that's a violation. You would need to report that into the clearinghouse, as well as, the successful completion of the of the follow-up programs and tests if you allow that. I know a lot of you have zero tolerance policies, and so you don't have programs that allow for drivers to go through that rehabilitation process. You need to also make sure that you are providing to the system documentation of a certificate of service. I believe that that's referring to like your annual medical card verification into that program. So reporting, your reporting duty also extends into violations that have to do with whether you have actual knowledge of a violation besides just, the results of a drug test or the refusal to do a drug or alcohol test. So employers are required to report by the close of the third business day each instance where they have actual knowledge that an employee driver has received, for example, a traffic citation that is a violation, so like a DUI or something like that, while driving a commercial motor vehicle. Also, if you have other actual knowledge. And so this is, from what I understand, this can be a little bit of a tricky situation. If you look in the regulations, there are specific regulations in there that deal with what constitutes actual knowledge. If you were to find if a driver had just come back into the yard and so they were just driving the vehicle and you looked inside the cab of their truck and there's empty alcohol bottles, in the truck, or other drug paraphernalia in the truck, or other evidence of, drugs being present in the vehicle, that could be deemed as actual knowledge that you would result in a violation. That would be a violation of the regulations, and you would have to report that actual knowledge into the system. It gets a little tricky though. Let's say your driver is gets a DUI off the clock driving his personal vehicle. He's not driving a commercial motor vehicle when he gets the DUI. That actually does not constitute, if you're aware of that DUI, that doesn't constitute actual knowledge for purposes of reporting into the clearinghouse. The violation didn't occur while operating a motor vehicle, and so that doesn't need to be reported into the system. I'm having a bit of a problem with my slides wanting to change here. Other reporting requirements. If you do use a third-party agent to help manage your drug testing program, the ultimate reporting responsibility is still yours, the employers. If your TPA messes up, if they don't report something that they should report, or they're not, following the program appropriately, that's on you. And so you need to make sure that your TPA is following all the regulations and reporting those events that require a report into the system. The exception is when you have an owner operator that uses a TPA. And in that case, the TPA has responsibility, direct responsibility themselves. But since, we're not actually owner operators, that probably isn't going to apply to any of us, at least not in our job with our local governments. So your substance abuse professional also has a reporting responsibility. So here's the little bit from the regulations of what that responsibility is. Basically, if we have a fail, then that goes into the system. If we are beginning a return to duty process using a substance abuse professional to manage that process, then that needs to be reported in the system. And then when that driver has completed that return to duty program and test, then that needs to be reported into the clearinghouse by the close of the following business day. And so that has something that actually the employer is going to be reporting on that return to duty test, but the SAP is also going to be reporting on that return to duty test as well. All of this information that we are entering into this system, it's very important that it be truthful and accurate. So you may see some redundancies on reporting between us reporting a violation and the MRO or the SAP reporting violations or completions of programs. And that redundancy kind of may help give us a little bit more confidence in the information in the system. But you do have a duty under the regulations to make sure you're not reporting false information into the system. And so, it requires that we be honest in the information that we put in there. If we're found to be entering information erroneously, especially if we're doing it intentionally, then there's a possible fine of up to $16,000 for entering untruthful or inaccurate information into the system. If you enter inaccurate information into the system accidentally, there are ways to get that corrected, and so that can be dealt with. Of course, you would need to catch that problem. Another aspect of the clearinghouse is that when information is entered into the system about a specific driver, or when information changes about a specific driver in the system, the drivers are required to be notified. And so it's actually the FMCSA that will provide that notification to the driver when something changes. So the FMCSA will notify the driver when there has been something added to their record or revised in their record, or when something's been removed from their clearinghouse record. And so the driver should be aware even before you are, if there's something in the system. So they need to be getting that consent, and when they do that, they should have a pretty good idea whether you're going to see something in there or not, because the FMCSA is required to give them notice when something changes. So you have to, give that notification to the driver, and it has to be provided to them. It'll come to them usually in the mail to the address that is currently on their commercial driver's license for whatever state they have a commercial driver's license from. However, the driver does have the opportunity to give an alternate address that those can be sent to. And on that previous slide I just moved off on, it also listed another time when the driver will get notification, and that is when information has been released to somebody. So the driver gives you consent, you go in, you run a full query on them, for example, and then the driver will get notification that the query was conducted and who conducted that query, so that the driver can, know, hey, I didn't give consent. I don't know how that person got consent, but it wasn't me. It's a safeguard there for the driver and protecting his private information there. So we also need to take a little bit of care, because as an employer who has a DOT required program with your commercial operators and your commercial vehicles, we want to make sure that we can have access to the system. And there are certain times when you may lose your access to the clearinghouse system. Number one is just an expiration of your current registration. Your clearinghouse registration is valid for 5 years, and for some reason it's canceled earlier or revoked for that 5 years. So every 5 years you'll need to go in and update your registration in the clearinghouse to keep your system active. How it can be canceled early is if you are inactive. If you have not gone into the system for 2 years, and if you haven't done any queries or entered any information into the system for 2 years, then they will cancel your registration so that you no longer have access. And remember, you're required to run a limited query at least every year on all your drivers. So unless for some reason you just don't have commercial drivers anymore, you should be in the system at least once a year, and that will keep your registered account active in there as long as you're doing that. The FMCSA also has a right to revoke registration for anyone who fails to comply with any of the requirements that are upon you as an employer in that system. So if they decide that you are not compliant or you've done one of the rules, then they can revoke the registration and your access into the system as well. So basically, just every 5 years, you're going to have to go in there and update that. Now, corrections, if there is a mistake in the system, maybe a driver wants to dispute some information. So a driver gets notice that something was added to his record, he looks at it and he goes, that's not right. I didn't have any failed drug tests, or I didn't have any DUIs, or whatever, it may be. Then there is a process where the driver can go in and submit a petition, and can detail the reasons why they believe the information is inaccurate. And so there is a process for them to be able to, go through a verification there and remove any inaccurate information that does get into the system. Now, the regulation, states that the FMCSA can collect a reasonable fee, for entities, to perform queries in the system. So at the time the regulations were written, they weren't quite sure exactly what those fees would be. But since then, and as we are now live, we know that those queries cost you about $1.25 each time. And it's the same whether it's a limited query or a full query. They're $1.25 each time. You can go in and you can pay for a whole bunch of queries all at once. But as I was looking at just the basic schedule, I didn't see a price break in there. It looks like no matter how many you buy, it's $1.25. But if you have to run 100 of these a year, then you can just go in and pay for 100 at once instead of individually. And that will make the system a little bit smoother, probably for you to be able to run those queries. Another point that was brought up in some of the information that I looked at in preparing for this is how drivers are identified on the drug testing forms, as well as in the system, in the Clearinghouse system. In the past, it's my understanding that there may have been certain situations where a driver was required to use their social security number as identification, either on drug testing forms or what have you. In recent years, there's been changes to privacy laws. And as a general rule, we shouldn't be using social security numbers for those identification numbers, because if they get out, if say we've chosen the employee's social security number to also be their identification number for drug testing programs, as well as reporting into the Clearinghouse, and that information gets out, then there could be some potential liability for that personal identification information getting out. However, the driver's license number isn't considered as sensitive personal identification information, and so it is recommended that you use for your driver identification their driver's license number for their CDL, along with the state of issue for that CDL license. So there's actually, as I understand it, in those situations where you have to make some sort of identification number, then you can really make up a number if you want to. You do want to be careful about using a social security number. But for consistency with the Clearinghouse, because the Clearinghouse will have the commercial driver's license number, the state of issue, that helps connect things a little bit easier if you use that number for identification. No employer can allow, a driver to operate a commercial vehicle during any period where the driver is not in compliance with the drug and alcohol testing and drug-free requirements under the DOT. And again, those requirements are things that you're already familiar with. Those violations have not really changed over the years. But here's just some examples of some of those things that we need to be on the alert for, that if they happen, we would need to report into the system. And we would also need to take the driver off of their safety sensitive duties, i.e. driving the commercial vehicle, if any of these occur. So if there's a positive drug test, or if there's adulterated or substituted drug test, that's something, that's a fail. That driver has to be removed from duty. If the driver receives an alcohol confirmation test with results of 0.04 or higher, and they make a big point that the alcohol test isn't a positive or a fail. The alcohol test, and as you're looking at your policies and procedures, when we talk about this in your policies and procedures, this is exactly how you should identify it. An alcohol confirmation test of 0.04 or higher, that is the fail. Whereas drugs, that's positive or negative. If it's a positive drug test, then that's a fail. If the driver refuses to submit to a test, whether refuses to you to submit to a test or goes to the clinic and then refuses to submit to the test, with the MRO there, then either way, that's a refusal to test. That's a violation. The driver has to be removed from duty. If the driver has used alcohol prior to the post-accident testing period, so if the driver's in an accident in the commercial vehicle, that triggers a post-accident screening under the DOT rules, and that driver has to not drink until they have to not drink for at least 8 hours until the test is done. If you remember the rules on that. Non-compliance. An employer, has actual knowledge, and so there's the code section in there where it talks about, the actual knowledge and how that's defined. I mentioned earlier, if you have personal, you've seen the driver, drinking or using drugs, during that period of time when they are either, on standby to perform their safety sensitive function, or actually performing their safety sensitive function, or immediately following the performance of their safety sensitive function. If you have that firsthand knowledge that they were drinking alcohol or using drugs, or you find paraphernalia or anything else that indicates a violation on them or in the vehicle or so forth, then that is a fail, and that driver needs to be removed from duty. And so there's that 4-hour rule, prior to performing safety sensitive functions for alcohol. So there can't be any alcohol consumption within 4 hours before reporting for duty. An employer has, and then the use of controlled substances. And so that comes into whether you either see the drug, or you see the drug use, or you see the evidence of the drug use there, while that driver is on duty or is required to be ready to perform their safety sensitive functions. Record retention. So with all of this, with your drug testing programs, with the record of violations that have occurred, all the records that are associated with your administration of the alcohol and controlled substance testing program, you have to make sure and retain those records so that they can be reviewed or audited. And I would assume the I looked at give an actual retention period, but as the information, the basic information stays in the system for 5 years, I would assume that you probably want to keep those records for at least that time period. You also need to make sure that you understand that certain officials can come in and access those records. So the Department of Transportation, or somebody that is authorized by the Secretary of the Department of Transportation, they have the right to come in and review your records with regards to your drug and alcohol program for the DOT requirements. And also, it can also be state or local officials who have regulatory authority, such as the Department of the Driver's License Division, for example, or even law enforcement may have access to these records. So just be aware, if someone shows up and they want to see these records, those are organizations that have that right to see those records. When requested by the NTSB as a part of a crash investigation, those investigators also have a right to come in and request information regarding the records on a driver with respect to your drug and alcohol testing program that falls into the DOT requirements. The FMCSA will also provide access to information in the clearinghouse concerning drivers who are involved in a crash under investigation. So they may come and want to see your records, and they also may be able to access the clearinghouse. And that same thing applies also to law enforcement and other entities that may have that regulatory authority over the commercial driver's license, who can access the clearinghouse information as well. There is a 3-year look back rule. You're probably already familiar with this. If you're hiring, a new driver, you need to go back and you need to check with any employers that they've driven for as a commercial driver back for the last 3 years. And so we have that requirement. For the time being, you're still going to have to do that manually. You're going to have to make those contacts and find out if there's, information that those employers have on any violations for this driver, because the clearinghouse is brand new. The only information that's going to be in there is stuff that has occurred in the last month that people have entered into the system. And so basically what we're looking at is over the next 3 years, as far as the look back goes, we're going to continue to, have to do those checks manually. But when we get to January 6th, 2023, then there should be 3 years of data in the clearinghouse. And after that point, those new hire checks can be done through the clearinghouse. And for most instances, you will not need to do a manual check where you're actually having to contact those previous employers anymore. There are some exceptions to that. For example, if the driver was removed from duty and didn't complete a return to duty program with the SAP, then that's a situation where you would, even after 2023, you would probably still need to contact the previous employer and find out what the details were of that return to duty program for that driver. If the applicant, is subject to, a drug and testing, a DOT drug and alcohol testing program, then, the employer has to request the alcohol and controlled substance information that's required under the regulation there from those other employers that were also regulated by DOT. But again, after 2023, you should be able to do the vast majority of that electronically through the clearinghouse. Driver notification to the employer of a violation. Generally you're going to be aware if your driver has a violation. Obviously, if your driver gets a DUI while they're driving your commercial vehicle, they have to inform you, but then you're going to be the one reporting into the system that there's been a violation. However, if that driver has secondary employment with another commercial carrier, then your driver is also required to make sure that you are notified of any violations, DOT violations that occur with that other employer as well. Updates to your policies and procedures. Obviously, a lot of the rules as far as what is a violation of the drug and alcohol testing program, those haven't changed. But where we have the requirement to be, reporting into the clearinghouse as well as running queries through the clearinghouse, you'll need to update your policies and procedures. You'll probably need to go in and change your consent forms that you have for your drivers, especially for those limited queries. And so you'll want to have a form prepared that your drivers will need to sign on that. So you'll need to go through and do some updates to your policies, procedures, forms in your toolkit. So if you already have like a DOT or FMCSA policy and forms toolkit, you'll need to go through and look at that. There may need to be some adjustments, some updates you need to do to that. You need to make sure that you adopt an internal reporting protocol so that when a violation occurs, the person who has access to the clearinghouse and is responsible for entering that information, making sure that they get that information so that it can be entered into the clearinghouse, so that there's not, lack of communication between supervisors or managers or other administrators. If you do use a third-party agent, there may be some changes and updates that need to be done to your service agreement there as well. And also, as always before, there are some training requirements both for drivers and supervisors when it comes to the drug and alcohol program. And so we need to make sure that that training is completed. Drivers need to understand the rules around, what is a fail, and, the post-accident testing and the drug and alcohol testing program. Supervisors need to be trained on reasonable suspicion determination, as well as, the other rules where they may need to trigger under the DOT regulations, a drug test or an alcohol test. I did find a really good document. It's about 60 or 70 pages, but there's a lot of really great stuff in there that gives a sample policy. For example, it's not 60 pages. But there's an outline in there about the clearinghouse program, things these requirements that we've talked about, things that you need to know and understand when implementing your program. There's a lot of really great information in this document about the effects of different drugs and alcohol on the person that can be incorporated into your training. And so we're going to send that out along with our post-webinar documents today. So along with the copy of the slides of the presentation, I'll send you a copy of that document, that sample document that has a lot of great information on this. So you'll want to go through that and take a look at it. And I think I'm also going to include a PDF that is a kind of a question and answer document from the FMCSA that kind of deals with some of the most common questions and information that people need to know about the program. So we'll send you a bunch of documentation that you can go back and also review or use for helping you update your programs currently. So in summary, one of the first things you need to do, you need to get registered as the employer of the driver. You need to get into the clearinghouse and you need to register so that you have an account set up in there. You need to get all of your commercial drivers who are operating commercial vehicles for you. Also, they need to get into that system and get registered. We need to have a written and electronic driver consent. So you'll want to have that written form prepared that you want to have all your drivers sign that will give you the consent you need to do those limited queries annually. But you'll also, when you do need to do a full query, you'll need to make sure your drivers know that they need to go in and give consent for that as well. You need to do those queries for any new drivers that you're hiring, and as well as the annual limited queries and any mandatory reporting, anything that is a failure or a violation of the drug and alcohol DOT program, that you'll need to be entering that information into the system. And take a look at your policies and procedures and your forms and your programs, and just update those so that they are up to date with this new system that is now required that you be participating in. So Jason, did you get a chance to prepare that survey?
I do. You want me to run it now?
Yeah, let's go ahead and run it now. I'm just kind of curious how many of you out there have already been into the clearinghouse and have set up an account or registered in the clearinghouse. And we'll just give that a minute. And then also, while you're responding to the survey there, if anybody has any questions, maybe we can take a stab at those as well.
Yeah, go ahead and type your questions into the chat box, the Q&A box. I do have one from Mary. She asks, when would be the best time to conduct the annual query for 2020, since there won't be much data in the system?
I think I don't have a definitive answer for you, Mary, on that one. I just logically would think that by January 6th of next year of 2021, because that will give us a year. It doesn't seem very logical that it would do anybody a whole lot of good to be running queries on right at the beginning of the program, especially if your drivers don't have any other employers that may have entered anything. That may be something that may require some additional information. But as I understand it, as long as you're running a query at least once a year, that should meet the requirement there. So sometime during the next year.
Okay. Looks like I'm just going to close the poll here. We didn't have a huge, let's see, it's just finishing up. A huge percentage actually participate in the poll, but of those that did, it's just finishing. Okay. Those numbers look like
so 10%.
10% had done that. Mm-hmm.
How many respondents were there? 31?
31 total, 16 participated. So
I kind of anticipated that. This is a new program. When someone asked me about it a month ago, I was like, what? I hadn't really heard of it before. And I suspect that a lot of you, maybe this is you've just barely heard about this maybe. recently, or you maybe weren't even aware that the launch date for the Clearinghouse was coming up. It was January 6th of this last month. So we are now required to be participating in this program. So that means that the vast majority of you out there need to take a look at that, log into that program today. I'm sorry, I should have put a link up in here for where to go to register for that. But if you just use your search engine for FMCSA Clearinghouse, you'll find their main website and be able to register there. It comes right up on the search. I apologize for not having that exact website
That was the other
for you
question
here.
that I had, was where do we log in? So
FMCSA Clearinghouse. You search that, you'll find it.
looks like that's all the questions that we have. And Doug and I fought over who would get the opportunity to present this presentation today. Oh, Doug was very gracious and took this one on the chin, because it's a whole new ball game, and definitely a challenging thing to wrap our minds around all of it. But thank you very much, everybody, for logging in. I'm just trying to see, was that a question? There we go. Doug lost. Scott says that Doug lost. Yeah, Doug was magnanimous and saw himself. Anyway, yeah, it's a challenging subject, and I imagine there will be much more information to come as we go forward. And so just watch out for that. And if you have some experience one way or the other, let us know, and we'll definitely share that with others out there.
We would definitely like to hear, your experience. The 10% of you that have done it already, I'd be really curious to know how it went for you, if it was easy to understand and get set up, and if you've had any experiencing yet running queries or entering any information into the system. We'd love to hear how it's working for you.
Yeah, for sure. Great. Thanks, Doug. We appreciate you taking the time to go through this, and I'm sure everybody out there is grateful as well. If you have questions or comments, please don't hesitate to give us a call or an email, and we'll do our best to answer those. And with that, final words, Doug?
That's it. Go out and have a very safe day today. Be real careful out there today, folks. Both, with your walking, this is one of those days, and we say it every year, the slip and falls on snow and ice. We look at these, and those are preventable. If you've got some extra traction device that you can put on your feet, this is a day for it. Take small steps, do the penguin walk so you don't slip and fall, and be real careful if any of you are out there shoveling any snow or anything today. And be really careful on the roads behind the wheel. Slow down, take it easy, and make sure that we don't have any unwanted incidents today. We want to make sure you all have a safe day. We would love to not see any new claims come in today, but that's probably not going to happen.
Cross our fingers. All right. Thanks, folks. Talk to you soon.